We love Classical Conversations.
Your organization is known worldwide, and we certainly appreciate every facet that you do.
I do believe in what you're doing because I've seen it in my family.
I'm so excited about all the things that, Robert, you guys do with Classical Conversations. It's been a huge blessing for our family.
Grateful for the work at Classical Conversations. You're a leader, and you have been in this movement for a long time.
I do feel like I have a debt of gratitude to you, your family, all of CC for just the fruit that has come from CC.
Appreciate all that you guys do, both through this wonderful podcast and also through Classical Conversations, which I am convinced is the best education resource out there. Thank you very much for all that you do for the cause of Christ and for our families and for our children. Really, really appreciate it.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another exciting episode of Refining Rhetoric. Today we are talking with attorney and counselor Kevin R. Novak. He practices law in Texas and Virginia. He's a former homeschool administrator and operates a small nonprofit, Deconstructing the Coliseum, that promotes Christian education and eliminating the civil government's involvement in education and discipleship. Prior to lawyering, Mr. Novak spent over 7 years in the insurance business and many years in Christ-centered basketball ministries and homeless outreach. A graduate of Liberty University Law, Mr. Novak admires Chief Justice John Marshall's jurisprudence and Dr. Greg L. Bancham's apologetics. Mr. Novak has co-authored in many op-eds and articles, and we are going to be talking a lot about his book, Abolishing, Overcoming the Christian Establishment on Education. Today, and as part of our school choice series that we are having a continuing discussion on, and I'm writing a book with Alex Newman on called Woke and Weaponized, which will be out very soon in January of 2026. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Robert. It's good to chat with you and get each other riled up for a little while.
Yeah. So I know you've talked with my mom a lot on this issue and have been on some podcasts with her. So abolition, typically we think about that as, you're either pro-choice or you're pro-life, but even in the pro-life movement, there's people who compromise, and then there's this abolition movement. But we're talking about abolition for public schools and the government. So, what is the abolition movement in Christian education?
Yeah, and as you had mentioned the example of abortion with the term abolition, and I was also thinking about it being used with slavery and the slave trade. So the word, I think, has a positive movement connotation to it. But in regards to abolishing the civil government's involvement with education, really it's based on this idea of jurisdiction. So typically when I talk about jurisdiction to anybody, lawyers or non-lawyers, I think immediately the idea is that jurisdiction is a legal term, and it is. But I think it has a broader application, especially when we look at scripture and we have the jurisdiction or lawful authority of the home. Well, first of all, even before that, the individual, the Psalms and the Proverbs speak to self-government, and tending to yourself first, and then the family government. So the family government would have certain lawful authorities, certain jurisdictions, certain areas that in which they operate, and then the church government, of course, and certain areas in which they operate, and then finally the civil government where they operate. So when we look at abolition, really it's building on the idea that there are these different governments: family government, church government, and civil government, with Jesus being the ultimate government at the top, and then specifically asserting the civil government has no rights, no God-given rights to be involved with education. And when we talk about that and build the premises and the arguments for that, the ultimate conclusion is that since the civil government should not be involved in education and discipling our kids, we should be abolishing their involvement in education. So that's really what we mean by abolition.
That probably sounds really radical to a lot of listeners, even people who maybe choose homeschooling or private school for themselves and their families. But this was kind of the standard operating procedure or thought pattern, even just 200 years ago inside the United States. So yeah, how did we get here today where your typical Christian pastor is probably too scared to preach, send your kids to a Christian school from the pulpit because he doesn't want to upset the teachers and the administrators that are in there. How did we get here?
Well, there's a book that I read reluctantly. I don't know the man who wrote it personally, so I don't want to say anything negative about him. But the book is called Founding Zealots. I think the gentleman's name is Hagedorn. And it basically chronicles the tactics, not just, because when a lot of people talk about the development of the modern school system, they tend to mention Horace Mann and John Dewey.
Sure.
And when you read, and then that's a tremendous oversimplification, and that's okay. I'm just saying that in terms of how we got here now, if people read Founding Zealots or even Sam Blumenfeld's book, I think it's called Is Public Education Necessary? They're going to understand the movement going back to the early 1800s with a lot of I don't get a chance to use this word that often, but the Harvardians and then the Unitarians, basically people in the Northeast that were looking at the perfection of man. And there was a lot that went on, but the short answer is a movement developed into wanting to educate people, educate the masses. And so that developed into, say, the mid 1850s, where infrastructure began developing. You had the Northwest Ordinance. Then little by little, inch by inch, you had the compulsory attendance laws, the compulsory education laws. You had the tax laws being implemented, and it just became this behemoth. In the old days, in the 1800s, on the federal level, we merely had an education bureau. It was actually just a bureau with like 3 people working there. And now, of course, we have this Department of Education. So in getting rid of the civil government's involvement in education, I think the blueprint is just undoing all those things that were done over time. That is real incrementalism. And undoing the taxing, the spending, the compulsory education, the education age window, in which had displaced our private discipleship infrastructure. So I think that's how we got here. If people want the nuances of it, Hagedorn chronicled it very well. But then Blumenfeld wrote about it in Is Public Education Necessary? And he talked about how these different liberal groups morphed in to one another and began to develop our modern infrastructure for civil government education.
I mean, it's important to know our history, otherwise we're doomed to repeat it. But I want to step a little bit farther back to the beginning of time and talking about, the biblical principles of civil government authority over education, over the development of a individual's minds. So why or where does the Bible say that the government shouldn't be involved in it? Or where do you get to the point where you understand like the difference between family, church, and civil government? Because I think a lot of people still don't quite grasp those different realms.
Sure. And it does take work. We're all in the beginning, we're all liberals, and it does take work to get to become a conservative. And I mean that, somewhat kiddingly, but in order to develop our minds and the way that we think, we do need to put effort into it. And I on our website, Deconstructing the Coliseum, we've got this jurisdiction chart. Mine's a little beat up because, I take it places and write on it and make notes, but your listeners can go and look at this jurisdiction chart, which has the different Bible verses for the different governments. So they can study that on their own. But I think ultimately you do have different Bible verses that support the idea of self-government, and then family government and church government and civil government. So civil government really being the power of the sword, the physical sword, and then the church government metaphorically being the keys in gatekeeping, the sacraments, and then also the rod with the home. So that's the very simple way of looking at the different governments. But then we get to this idea where you have a delineation, and we could call this the separation of church and state. You know, there are a lot of misunderstandings about the separation of church and state, and liberals really like to beat up on us with that. But there really is a separation of church and state. And what I mean by that is there is a distinction or delineation, a separation between what the church government is supposed to do and what the civil government is supposed to do. And that is I think the base of the argument for limiting the civil government. Now, more tightly, when we begin to look at Romans 13, and then I think the same verbiage is in, I want to say 2 Peter 2:14, where we look at, I think it's propositional, telling us what should be done, and that is the civil government is supposed to be overseeing actions, not thought, but using force and coercion to punish evildoers. And so that speaks more broadly to how the civil government is not supposed to be affecting people through force and coercion via education and discipleship. And then we look back to the positive verses for the family government and the church government, and there's so many of them throughout Scripture, and mainly Ephesians 6:4, where it's the fathers, the parents that are supposed to be raising the children in the Lord's nurture and admonition. But one way to turn it around on Christians who think that the civil government can be involved in education is to ask them pretty bluntly, do you think that we ought to be advancing Christianity through the power of the physical sword? And the simple answer to that is no. So that's the broad argumentation for limiting the civil government's involvement in education.
Yeah, so because we don't have a lot of physical in-your-face violence anymore, it's hard for people to understand that taxation can be a form of violence, right? The government is going to take the sword and take your neighbor's house if they don't pay these taxes, and then using those tax dollars now to advance your own agendas, no matter how pure they may be, violates the "thou shalt not steal," "thou shalt have no other god before thee," "thou shalt not envy." Right, just three of the 10 commandments. You can quickly see how they are, abusing those ideas to further their own vision, even if I agree with their end results. So, when you wrote Abolition, you talked about overcoming the Christian establishment. I would maybe say that today in 2025, when we're recording it, the Christian establishment has become even kind of stronger, or at least trying to become stronger in these areas. But yeah, what are you specifically mentioning, and why has it failed to really do a sound biblical position on education?
I do think there are different types of people and different types of organizations that are part of the Christian establishment. And when I say Christian establishment, I basically mean Christians that are in leadership positions that are gatekeeping a revival or gatekeeping our advancement. And I think that education is as close as you're going to get to a silver bullet for sparking a revival. And I know that God is responsible for revivals. I'm just saying in an operational sense, our involvement in it. But when I look back at when I was writing the book and I was learning about theology, and I'm a Reformed thinker, I can't say that everybody I know that's Reformed agrees with me, and I can't say that everybody who's non-Reformed disagrees with me. That's the beauty of this, is I don't have to rely on John Calvin to argue this. I can rely on the scriptures. But I think in learning more about theology, going through law school, reading Greg Bahnsen, John Calvin, even Martin Luther, and just developing in learning more about history, I think that there are different theologies and different groups that have gotten us here and are responsible for the civil government being allowed to be in education. And I'll give you a couple examples. One are the dispensationalists, premillennial dispensationalists, people who think that we're living in this parenthetical age and, God is dealing with us just now and he's only interested in getting people to heaven, not necessarily being Christian thinkers. And that's an oversimplification, but I think dispensationalism has really harmed American Christianity. Gary DeMars and Gary North, they've been very helpful in teaching people about this. So dispensationalists. I also think a group of people called antinomians, people who are like against the law. When they look at the Old Testament, they think they're somewhat repulsed by it. Ironically, they're not repulsed by the Ten Commandments, which are in the Old Testament, but they think we're living in this New Testament age where we only need to get people to heaven, and really our goal ought to be to move to foreign lands and just evangelize people and kind of be martyrs. So you have those kinds of people. You also have people that think that you can reform the civil government school system. They think erroneously that you can reform something that shouldn't exist in the first place. And then you have another group of people who I would call the pietists, who would say, well, we're just supposed to kind of say that Christianity is in our hearts, and it's a self morality. It's not a worldview that you externalize in culture or in politics, especially in politics, because that's a big no-no in many Christian circles. And of course, you get some people who are just downright lazy or uninspired by what God has to say, and they're not interested in winning. One of the refreshing things about I see with Donald Trump, he's got flaws, but I love how he likes to win, and he's not afraid of that. And so that doesn't speak to us needing to use the power of the civil government sword to beat people in submission. It's the opposite. We need to exercise culture and politics to persuade people. But you've got those different groups, and I think they kind of all work together to prevent us from really making progress that we can make if they got on board with us.
The classical learning cohort is comprised of small groups of CC parents learning how to become more confident, competent classical teachers. We provide a welcoming place of mentorship while practicing classical skills and hospitable assessment. With feedback from peers and mentors, you will experience transformational growth as a classical Christian educator. Why not sample the CLC by attending a free online event with a CLC member? Go to classicalconversations.com/cohort and search Experience a CLC event to find a time that fits your schedule.
One of the things that the Christian establishment seems to be embracing is this idea of school choice, and not necessarily that you should be able to homeschool or private school, but the government should fund everyone's choices. And the thought is that it's going to, we fund maybe pagan ideas, so why don't we fund Christian ideas? Yeah, as you explore and you kind of looked at, the history of education in our country, you've looked at the Bible, you understand, jurisdiction. Yeah, where have you come down on this school choice debate so far?
Well, I'm all for school choice. I think that the problem is it's a completely different version. And now our movement has needed to come up with a different term. I think we've settled on education freedom, although that term could also be equivocated or hijacked. But I don't think school choice is a solution. And I think that a lot of people that would disagree with me would say that I'm paranoid about the civil government taking over homeschooling. And I say sarcastically that we could never expect the civil government to become tyrannical and utilize the law against us. Just ask Donald Trump, or just ask someone who fishes off of the East Coast, how many administrators they have to deal with on a daily basis. But I think the primary reason why I'm against school choice is because it's socialism. And when I say socialism, it's the redistribution of wealth. It's using the force of law to take money from these people and give it to these people. And that's disappointing when even people in church are okay with that happening. I have struggled for a long time to understand why it is that people don't understand that school choice really is just them taking our money from us and asking us to jump through hoops to get it back. I'm always reminded of that. I don't know if you ever watched that TV show Friends.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to watch it if you never watched it. But there was this one episode where Rachel got like her first paycheck, and she looked at it and she said, "Who's FICA? Who's FICA?" Like she didn't know who FICA is. I just wonder, and not trying to be condescending. I just wonder, innocently, do people really just not understand that our money is taken from us and then we want it back? A real school choice is, let me keep my money in the first place and you keep your money in the first place. And if you need help or I need help, we'll help each other. But we don't need to pay socialist gatekeepers, 6-figure salaries just so we are required to fill out paperwork so that our kids can homeschool or get a $2,000 voucher when we paid $7,000 in taxes. So that I'm against school choice. I'm pro education freedom, and I'm comfortable with freedom. I can operate in a freedom environment, and I think Christians need to learn to be comfortable with that too.
Yeah, one of the things I hear from people is, well, I'm just trying to get my money back, but most of these programs, you're getting thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars more back than you're actually paying into the system. So where's that money coming from?
Yeah, and I don't know if it's changed, but last time I looked at Arizona's laws, people were raving about it, the school choice laws, and at that point, people were getting 90% back of what they put into it. And on its face, that sounds good, but I don't know about other people, but I don't need you to take 10% of my money just for me to exercise the freedoms that come from God. I don't need that. And I'd rather have 110% of my money back. And that's why I try to be a good steward of my money and invest it. But my money being forcefully taken from me by the civil authorities is not productive. And I'll tell you another thing along these lines. A lot of Republicans, and here in Texas, we just went through the school choice battle, and they like to talk about accountability. I don't care about accountability. I don't need you to tell me what you're doing with my money. I just don't want you to have my money, because it's almost like accountability, this guise of accountability for them telling us how they spent our money, is supposed to soothe our anger. It doesn't soothe my anger. It doesn't fool me at all. I just want to keep my money in the first place.
One of the things people say is, well, people can't afford homeschooling or private schooling. And I thought you addressed that really well in your book. So what are some of the things that maybe preconceived notions, and I think maybe playing on Rachel's FICA discussion, kind of like what would be the solution then if the government's not going to steal from my neighbor to pay for some kid's education? How else could we pay for it?
Well, I do think that real incrementalism would be lowering taxes. And again, this would be undoing what Hagedorn chronicled in his book, because little by little, the civil government in every single state and on every single level looked for ways to fund education. And then they made it worse, because socialism is such that every dollar they take, it's not like you're getting that dollar back. it's futile to think that. The math doesn't work out that way because civil government actors need to be paid. But I think at the end of the day, really what would happen is we would have, like we used to, private mechanisms that individuals would pay for. And I do think it sounds so obvious, but I think I do need to remind people or teach people that they would be able to afford an education if their taxes weren't so high. And then we would have the free market forces competing for those dollars. And, one of the things that is worth talking about too, and we could talk more about some of these nuances in greater detail some other time. But when the civil government starts to issue checks to people, the private sector naturally is going to increase their rates to meet that. So it's possible that education costs are going to increase because of school choice in different states. Now, whether that's happened mathematically, I'm not prepared to throw statistics out there because of that. But in a real freedom environment, it would be, I keep my money and you keep your money. We have no education infrastructure that's owned and operated by the civil authorities. We have private infrastructure, even for sports. And then we would also have private mechanisms that are helping people. My wife and I learned, I'm not trying to brag, but we're just trying to do our part. My wife and I learned yesterday that some people that want to join CC are going to have some trouble doing that. CC is very affordable, so I don't want to imply that it's expensive, but they're going to need help because it's going to be close. So we're going to help them. And that's really, at the end of the day, what people ought to be doing, and they will be able to do it if they're not being taxed.
Yeah. I like your illustration in the book. You're talking about, well, Pastor, I'd like to give money to this cause and that cause, but the civil government's stealing so much of it from me, I can barely afford to provide my family. And we know that the free market does drive down prices. I don't know which company it was, but I was on a call with Israel Wayne. He writes a lot about apologetics, and he said he was at a homeschool conference, I think in Arizona. The company had not been approved for the ESAs, and they were charging like $1,000 or something for their product. And he went back the next year, spoke at the same conference, and now their booth basically said, hey, we'll fill out the ESA paperwork for you. And their product went from $1,000 to $3,000. And I saw in Arkansas, their full program hasn't rolled out, but their pilot program or their initial program, like the Old Schoolhouse magazine found, and I think Neary found it as well. Typical homeschoolers are spending around $1,000 plus or minus, $500 or so homeschooling their kids. Well, in Arkansas, it's over $3,000. So you can see right there that they're spending 2 to 3 times the amount, maybe even 6 times the amount of a typical homeschooler when they start getting that government money. So yeah, I think that inflation, we're going to see it eventually because it's not a free market, it's a quasi market, and those two things are very different. You're in Texas, and in many Republican states, they're talking about this idea of getting rid of property taxes. You argue that property taxes are unconstitutional, but property taxes, at least here in North Carolina, about half of them are going to the public school system. So, are property taxes unconstitutional, and how does that fund this behemoth of a education industry?
Well, I'll tell you, if you're in a state where only half of your property taxes are going to the civil government schools, that's actually pretty good. I think it seems to me, I've only lived in 4 different states, but it seems to me like that's low. But I think, there actually was some noise generated in the last couple of years because our legislature here in Texas only meets every other year. And there was some noise about, okay, Texas has so many people moving here, businesses, and there's a great energy sector here. So in other words, we were doing well financially. And so there was some chatter about lowering property taxes, or at least the state putting some limits on that. But I think it was Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick that spoke out against that. And I think that's where you get a lot of people in the Republican establishment that they get nervous about their money not being available to do things. And that's where, we get into school choice, where they've increased the budget now by $1 billion just to give money to people who want to be involved in private education. And so I don't see in the short term where property taxes are going to be reduced here in Texas, because we don't have an income tax. I think they're loath to really deal with it, and the political pressures on the local people, not the people in Austin. I personally think, now this is somewhat tongue in cheek, but I personally think that the property taxes are unconstitutional because they're unbiblical. And I think to a lot of people that's comical, because they're used to thinking that the constitutions are self-authenticating, are self-authoritative, but they're not. There's always something undergirding, unless we're talking about the scriptures. So the point is that on the federal level, we really need to get back to necessary and proper spending, and not taxing and spending on anything under the sun, including education dollars. That's in Article 1, Section 8. But on the state level, I think property taxes are unconstitutional because they're unbiblical. And I don't think that it's proper for the civil government to levy a perpetual tax on someone's property, because that becomes, in fact, or in a de facto sense, ownership of that property, if that makes sense.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah, and a lot of it is just me, kind of pushing back and really getting those arguments out there so people start to think about them. That's all.
Yeah. Well, for our last question, how important is it for the church to get back to making sure that its children are being given a Christian education? Can anything really be fixed if the church is still sending allowing their children to go to the pagans to be taught math and English and history?
I don't really think so, and I'm optimistic. I think what's more likely to happen is the groundswell, the grassroots. I go to church, but I don't expect the pastor to speak on this issue. So I think ultimately what's going to happen is you're going to get so many people in the pews, and I see a little momentum in our direction, that they're ultimately going to be forcing pastors to be involved in this issue. I don't see the congregation getting involved in the issue because the pastor is getting them to do so. I see it happening the other way around, where it's the congregation is going to be like, hey, where are you on this? And why are you not leading us and helping us and helping the community? So, I guess in some ways, there is a difference between the physical church, the buildings, the infrastructure. But in terms of the spiritual church, I think that's it. I think it's growing, and I think it's getting better. And I think we're finally getting to the point where our remnant are beginning to think like Christians, and they're starting to be more receptive to the idea of jurisdiction and eliminating the public school system. When I go to conferences or homeschool conventions, people will see abolish public schools and they're all in on it. They may not know why. They may not it's okay. They may not be able to say, well, it's because of jurisdiction and lawful authority and this and that, but they're all in on it. In the homeschool community, the private education movement, classical conversations, all these different groups that are building and building and building, I think they're going to swallow the churches. And that's where I think our momentum is going to come from. So the spiritual church getting better, the physical church got a ways to go.
Amen. Well, there's only one perfect person, Jesus, and so I'm just trying to follow him. So Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today. Where can people get your book, Abolition? And where can they learn more about your organization?
So they can learn about our organization at deconstructingthecoliseum.com. They can learn about me as a person at kevinrnovak.com. And then they can buy the book at amazon.com.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today in this important conversation and just helping Christians and Christian leaders to wake up to their proper role and what God's given them authority over, we need to retake.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your part too. And we're making great progress.
Well, thank you all for listening to the episode today. If you enjoyed it, please share it with a friend. And please tune in to all of our school choice episodes that are coming out right now. Until then, God bless and have a great day.
Thank you for listening to Refining Rhetoric with Robert Bortons. Want more? Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss an episode. You can also follow us on social media to continue the conversation, and visit classicalconversations.com/rhetoric to find out how you can join a local homeschool community.